There's a lot of conversation circling about milk alternatives and their potential impact on global dairy consumption, alongside what they mean for dairy farming as we know it in New Zealand. But what do we mean by milk alternatives? And what are the differences between plant alternatives and this thing called precision fermentation? Also, where are milk alternatives at, and what are the facts and the myths about new and existing products? Here to talk about this with us today is Professor Warren McNabb, who's Professor of Nutritional Sciences at the Riddet Institute, Massey University. Warren will discuss how milk alternatives have developed to date and what the future is looking like. Keep an eye out for our April-May issue of Inside Dairy and listen out for a podcast coming out soon, both of which will bring to life an exciting piece of research by DairyNZ called Frontier Farms. This research aims to keep New Zealand dairying ahead of our global competitors, and milk alternatives are one of the topics being evaluated as part of that project. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this podcast to make sure that you get notified when new episodes go live. Let's get started. Warren, thank you for joining us on the podcast. It's very good of you to give up your time. I know it's precious, so thank you. You have a broad and interesting background. I was doing a bit of reading on you. Tell us about the Riddet Institute and what your role is there.
Sure. I'm a professor of nutritional sciences at the Riddet Institute, and my role here is very much around nutrition, and I kind of do that in two major areas. One is a program we call New Zealand Milks Mean More, which is really about milks from all ruminants, so sheep, goats, cows, deer, and looking at their value nutritionally because there are differences between the species, but also as a consequence of normal dairy processing. So at the moment, when you look at, say, processed milk, the one you buy, and the milk that comes out of the cow, it's an assumption that they're not changed by the processes that occur. That's not true. There is different nutritional effects depending on what processing has occurred. So there's a big program on that. And then the other area is in sustainable nutrition. And we have an initiative, the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, which is looking at three levels. So we have a global model that looks at how do you feed the planet. We have a model we're developing now, which is about New Zealand. So how does this work for New Zealand? And then we're doing a model for the individual, and it enables them to make decisions about why they select foods. Is it simply cost? Is it nutrition? Is it environmental consequences? Is it the whole? They can make decisions based on that, and the model will tell them, the best kind of diet. And then at the national level, it's really looking at what we call well-being. So it's the well-being of people, and it's the well-being of place. So the environmental consequences, social consequences of New Zealand's food production system. So that's the kind of areas I work in, and they're all really interesting.
And you've been there since 2016, that's right, eh?
Yeah, so I came here about then. Prior to that, I was at AgResearch, where I was the research director for about 6 years. And prior to that, I was a scientist at AgResearch. So I think I spent nearly 30 years working for AgResearch, something like that.
Now, Warren, there are a couple of key types of milk alternatives that are either currently available on our shelves or in development.
Yep.
Can you give us a bit more understanding about those different alternatives? Break that down for us.
Sure.
What they are and where they are on their journey.
Yeah, so the ones that's probably everyone's aware of, because there are lots of products in the marketplace, are plant-based alternatives to milk, things like soya, oat, and they're there now, and you can go and buy them. And we're seeing development of those over the recent times. And then there are some more futuristic looking things. One is, and the main one there is what they call precision fermentation. And so that enables you to take essentially a gene from an animal for a milk protein. You put that gene into bacteria or yeast so that they express it, and then you harvest that protein, from the fermentation, and then you can use that pure protein for on development into food applications. And so some people have expressed a number of milk genes taken those individual proteins and then remixed them to create milk, or what they're calling milk. And the idea behind this kind of approach is it reduces the need for lots and lots of dairy cows. And so the argument is that that's going to be environmentally better. There's a certain amount for the plant-based where there's some environmental arguments as well. I think the concern for me is the evidence to support those claims. There's lots of claims, but I'm not sure if many of them really have the evidence to say they're correct. So in terms of those plant-based milk alternatives, we recently did a bit of work on them, comparing them to milk just to see how it went. And roughly the milk you buy, about 3 grams of protein per serve. Most of those alternatives less than a gram, and so therefore you'd need about 18 servings to give you the same amount of protein as you get from a single serving of milk. So there's a nutrient difference. There's a cost difference. So if you they're much more expensive than milk, so that's an important thing for a lot of people. And the thing that I think is really important about milk, and we often we don't actually think about this much, so milk is protein, and people focus on protein, and occasionally we focus on calcium, and so milk becomes protein and calcium. Actually, that's not true. Milk is an excellent source of a range of nutrients, and many that are important to us, and particularly micronutrients. And in fact, I would argue that milk is more important as a source of micronutrients than it is as a source of protein. And calcium being one of them, but others as well. And of course, when you're working with plant alternatives, they don't have those kind of micronutrients, so they're not nutritionally similar. And yet you hear people advertising and saying, well, here's this alternative, it's nutritionally as good as milk. That's not true. So that's the kind of alternatives. They're there. If you like them, great, drink them. But they're not the panacea in terms of nutrition or being environmentally more friendly. We worked out that if you remove milk from our intake, you would reduce our emissions by about 1%. And so our milk contributes relatively low emissions. If you then replace that protein with alternatives, then depending on the source, soya, oats, that drops to about 0.4%. But if it's from other plant sources, so nuts, etc., coconut, actually your emissions go up. So they're not as environmentally friendly as milk. So that's the alternatives. So I have lots of people around me who like it and drink it, particularly with coffee. But you just got to be realistic about the reasons. And Jeremy Hill, one of his favourite things that he says is he loves to be in airports, watching people at cafes drinking alternative milks, and then talking about environmental consequences, when actually the plane they're getting on to fly somewhere is so much worse, right? So in terms of that environmental consequences, I think our total yearly emissions from food is covered off by a flight from Wellington to Auckland. You got to be realistic, right? And on the precision side, there's a whole lot of things that have to be sorted out. I mean, first of all, it's the gene that you take from a cow, and you've got to express it in the fungi or yeast or whatever you're fermenting. So it's a GMO as a consequence. So and that has a whole lot of rules around it from a food use point of view that need to be addressed. And that's at different stages in different countries. If you want to, we've got a little model that we developed as part of SNI, which helps us look at consequences of using precision fermentation. And if we set that model up where we want to produce 10% of the world's current protein from a single milk protein, which would seem a reasonable target for that kind of technology, the downstream influences needed are huge. The fermentation industry needed to do it is ginormous. If the energy source is something like sugarcane, you'd have to look at total sugarcane production in the world and increase it by 40% to have enough sugarcane to do it, and still satisfy all the other uses of sugarcane. The energy required to run the system is significant. And the model works out that it requires all the power produced by a couple of smaller Eastern European countries would have to be dedicated to it. So the downstream consequences of this, once you move it out of the lab and into a kind of commercial setting, are quite large. You have to think about those, and that all that does is produce a white powder, and then you've got to think about, well, how do I turn that into a food application from a point of view of making products that people can consume? So I'm sure it's coming, but I'm not sure of the timelines, and I struggle with the idea that it's going to be globally significant. I think it's going to be significant to people who are in well-off situations and well-off countries. I don't think it's a solution for helping people who have very low incomes and are principally worried about just getting enough nutrients so they don't starve. I struggle to see this as a solution for that situation, because how would you produce these products in a way that's cheap enough compared to, say, just normal milk?
So there are currently no precision fermentation products on the market here or global
Not that
or
I'm aware of.
anywhere.
Not in New Zealand. There's been a few, where they've produced proteins and mixed them and then come up with kind of a milk or something that looks like milk, but they're not really commercially sold. I mean, it's very early technology and it promises a lot. And the question is about whether that can be delivered.
I have this question for you. I think you may have answered it already, but I'll put it to you, and then if you've got any other thoughts, please add them. But I was going to ask you, one key consideration for consumers is obviously nutrition. They want to get their
Yep.
nutritional needs met.
Yep.
And I was going to ask you to explain how the different alternatives might compare with traditional dairy and what that
Yep.
means for global nutritional requirements. Have you
Yep.
answered that already, or have you got anything else you'd like
No,
to
I
add?
mean, it's a good question. In our modeling work, when we look at total food production and then turn that into total food consumption, then it's currently about 75% plant and about 25% animal sourced, which includes dairy. The real importance of animal source foods and dairy in particular is as a concentrated food. So very high in nutrients and relatively low in energy. So when you include it in a diet, its power is those nutrients that it delivers for a relatively low energy content. And so from a nutritional point of view, what's important about milk really is, its role in delivering specific nutrients. So milk delivers about half of the world's calcium consumption. The world is short of calcium globally, but milk is the major source of calcium. It's a major source of a number of other micronutrients and alternatives. So if they're plant-based, they don't deliver that kind of nutrition. They're not concentrated forms of nutrition. If you're fermenting, then what you ferment is the protein and not the other nutrients, right? And so it depends how you then turn it into a food in terms of other nutrients. So to me, that's where milk has a role to play. When we model taking milk out altogether and making, a non-milk situation, it's actually almost impossible to come up with a food system that will generate all the nutrients needed by the world's population. It's really hard to find combinations that can replace milk. And there used to be those ads a long time ago from the meat guys where you had a little 180 grams of steak giving you a certain amount of iron, and then next to it you had this huge pile of spinach to give you the same amount of iron. That's the problem when you're looking at, say, plant alternatives to an animal sourced food like milk, is you need quite a lot to come up with those nutrients that are concentrated in the milk you drink. And it's quite difficult to make it balance. So it's really important.
Warren, what does it mean when we're talking about a food system that is plant based and animal optimized? What does that
Yep,
mean? And can you give us a bit more background on the current global food inputs and
sure.
outputs and food usage and
Yep,
wastage?
yep. So the handle plant-based and animal optimized is something that SNI came up with, and we've been, tagging um, along the way. And it comes from the fact that when you model total food production and you look at it, as I said before, about 75% of the nutrients we consume as a population are plant sourced, and then 25% are animal food sourced. But because animal foods are concentrated forms of a food, they deliver nutrients in a way that plants don't, because they tend to do it. They're concentrated, they're low in energy, and they become an important way of getting a lot of trace elements and micronutrients. You can't get, and some are specific. You can't get vitamin B12 from plants. You've got to have an animal source for that. So it's usually meat, although milk does contain vitamin B12. So if you're not eating milk or meat, then you have to supplement yourself with vitamin B12 pills to make sure you get an adequate intake. And vitamin B12 is really important to neural function. The calcium, if you remove milk from your diet, then you struggle to get anywhere near enough calcium because alternative sources of calcium are not great. And also, the bioavailability of calcium from plants is much lower than from milk.
Warren, sorry to interrupt, but can you just explain what you mean by bioavailability?
Yeah, so at the moment, a lot of people will say that this product has 10 grams of calcium and this product has 10 grams of calcium. But the availability of that calcium varies from food to food due to matrix effects. So the way the calcium is packaged in that food. And so in plants, it tends to be much lower than, say, in milk. And so if you have a serve of milk with a certain amount of calcium, and then you have a serve of a plant product which has the same amount of calcium, because calcium's been added, then that calcium tends to come from inorganic sources, and its availability is really low. And so they're not the same in terms of supplying calcium to us. The same with iron. So heme iron, the kind that you find in meat, is much more available to us than the non-heme iron that you find in plants. And so if you're getting all your iron from non-heme, means you have to eat quite a bit more plant than you do have to eat meat and getting it from heme sources. So, that's why we say plant-based, animal-optimized, because it's about balancing out the
Mhm.
total nutrients we need. It's not just energy and protein, which people tend to focus on, it's all the other things. And we know now that in terms of total food production, if it was equitably distributed, which it's not, but if it was, there's enough protein and energy to feed the 2030 world population right now, and probably enough to do the 2050 population as it's predicted to be. It's really these micronutrients and trace elements which are the big issue in terms of population growth and being able to adequately feed people.
Another thing that consumers are obviously thinking about, well, some consumers, is sustainability. How does traditional dairy sustainability, greenhouse gases, water
Yeah,
requirements, etc., compare with milk alternatives? And
sure.
I'll just add that we had one farmer put a question along these lines to us over social media. At Ole underscore La Black asked if alternative milks were more CO2 efficient than New Zealand dairy products.
Oh, don't know the answer to that question. I mean, environment's really complex, right? And people often talk about environmentally sustainable with the view that there must be a number. You know, this system's 6 and that system's 8. But there's actually a lot of components to environmental sustainability. I mean, there's greenhouse gases, there's land use, there's water, both the amount and then the quality of it, which has obviously implications for the swimmability of rivers. So there's a lot in this idea of environmentally sustainable. And depending on what food you're talking about, it varies, right? So a really good example is almonds. Almonds potentially are environmentally damaging because of the amount of water you need to produce almonds. And you see that in California. It's basically a desert as a consequence of the amount of almonds they grow. And you get a lot of variance across the world. So if you look at, say, dairying, obviously greenhouse gases is important, but New Zealand is the lowest in terms of its contribution to greenhouse gases. And other countries are, 3, 4, 5 or more times worse than us in that regard. So, you really got to look closely when you're thinking about what are the environmental consequences of a production system. Then it's the whole environment, climate change link. And, the reality is New Zealand's very small. And so our contribution to climate change is very small in terms of driving climate changes. And, that's more about much bigger economies. But we still need to be doing the right thing and looking to try and improve our agricultural systems in terms of the environmental consequences of them. And that's why we see lots of things like riparian plantings around waterways, all the work that's going into finding technologies to reduce greenhouse gases, and so on. So yeah, I think it's really important, but it's a very complex thing to talk about, and there's
Mm.
not really a simple, easy answer.
Okay. There's a lot of investment going into milk alternatives. I was sort of trying to find what the size of this was, but it looks like the size of the global alternative milk market was valued at around somewhere 22 to 25 billion US
Sure.
in 2021. What's the future looking like there for precision fermentation in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be blunt, I don't know the answer. Um, most of that value at the moment is driven through alternatives, not precision fermentation, because there aren't really products out of that yet that are on the market. And those alternatives changing, the total amount of them is not really growing, but within the category, there's movements, right? So, we're seeing some decline and others grow. Oats is a good example. It's growing, but against a backdrop of a relatively flat value of the total market. And I think those alternatives will continue, and there'll be new ones using different types of plant material. We've been doing some work on hemp as a source of protein for making milk alternatives. The precision one, I think, is a fair way off. There are a lot of very big technical issues that need to be solved for it to be to make a significant impact commercially in the milk sector. And so what would it be worth in the future? It's really hard to know, because the technical issues that need to be solved in terms of just size of industry to produce these things, is going to be interesting. I can remember an article last year where a company had announced, in terms of cellular meat, so this idea of growing meat in a petri dish, they were going to open a factory that was going to produce 5,000 of these patties a day. And there was a whole lot of, great, this is excellent, this is real progress. So I did some calculations, and 5,000 meat patties is what McDonald's use in 1 second.
Oh my gosh.
So it gives you an idea just of the sheer size that we're talking about.
And how much McDonald's we're eating.
Yeah, yeah. And so for it to be impactful at a global level, you're talking about quite large. So I think it's more likely to be impactful at a level where people have a higher living, where they're not so worried about food from a point of view of just getting nutrients and not starving. They're able to make other choices. Yeah, I think these products are likely to be more into that kind of part of the market, as opposed to broadly available to everyone. So yeah,
Mm.
ways off, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit tough asking you to put a dollar value on
Yeah.
where the market's going. Sorry. Hey, lastly, Warren, and something that farmers will be really interested in knowing about.
Yep.
What are your key messages for New Zealand farmers about traditional dairy's role in future food systems? Another way of asking that is perhaps what does the future of alternative milks mean for dairy farmers?
Uh, Look, I think dairy farmers should be focused on the milk they produce and proud of it. It's a really important food within a food system, and because it's actually difficult to replace. And in regards to the nutrients it delivers to the food system. So that's looking at total milk production across the world, and the impact it has on the global population. It's really important. I find it hard to believe or see how you could develop a food system that adequately fed the global population that didn't include milk. We've done modeling to look at could we take the world's population completely vegetarian or completely vegan? And it's not possible. We just cannot produce enough plant nutrients with the land that's available to them to feed the world's population. So, I think milk is going to be intrinsically important to our nutrition into the future, without a doubt. Actually, a lot of people talking about actually needing more milk because of that link between milk and nutrients delivered. I know we've done some work in China, and to meet government requirements for adequate nutrition for the Chinese population, it's going to require a massive increase in the amount of milk they use in their diet, because you just can't get the nutrients otherwise. So I think farmers who in New Zealand who are producing milk should be proud of the fact that they're doing it. They're one of the lowest in terms of environmental footprint in the world. They're making every effort to get better at that, and you can see that happening. So yeah, I mean, if there's people who talk about, well, should we just produce milk where it's done efficiently as opposed to everywhere? And they point to New Zealand. Well, they do this efficiently. Maybe we're better off. It won't work for us. We don't have enough capacity to meet the demands. But it does say that there's opportunity for our dairy industry, I think, from a nutritional perspective, way into the future. I think the alternatives are there to supplement, because people will prefer them. They like the flavor, whatever. They've made decisions to be vegans, which is, that's a person's choice if that's what they want to do. So those products are going to be required for that reason. I'm not so sure if we're going to feed the globe in that way, because I'm not sure if we can generate enough nutrients to do that.
Hey, I was interested in knowing, what does it look like for you going out for a brunch with a bunch of people and you get into a chat about, because these days, there's oat milks and almond milk. Do you end up having those conversations with people quite regularly?
It's actually really interesting, because a lot of our early work in SNI was about global. How do you feed the globe? Which actually doesn't help you about how to feed an individual. So I could be a vegan and satisfy all the requirements to do that in a healthy way, but I can't figure out a way to model a global system for everyone to be vegan. So, so individual choice is individual choice. What do you want to do? So I don't tend to get into conversations where I'm trying to tell people that's bad, because it's not, right? That's their choice. You hope that they have an understanding of the consequences of their choice. So if you decide to be vegan, you have to think about, where am I getting iron from, B12? There are key nutrients that you do have to be cognizant of if you're a vegan, because no animal products means you're not sourcing them. But I have no problem with that choice. If that's what's important to you, that's what works for you.
Yeah. Hey, so good talking to you, Warren. Thank you. You're great to chat with, and like I say, I feel like we could chat about this and go off on all sorts of tangents, but we'll try and keep it in the time limit, because typically farmers are listening to this while they're going to get the cows in, and probably don't have too much time after that. So, hey, good man. Thank you for your time.
No, pleasure. It was good to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in to Talking Dairy. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to check out more of our podcasts, go to dairynz.co.nz/podcast or find us on your favourite podcast platforms. Catch you next time.